All right, very good. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Goldberg. I work at Public Works in the project management section assigned to the Earthquake Safety Bond Program. I'll be the hearing officer for tonight's hearing. My job as a hearing officer is trying to hear both sides of the story, whatever issues people want to bring up in regards to the matters on the agenda. I then make a recommendation to the director. Ultimately, it's the director's decision about how he will proceed. Either he can reject my recommendations, he can support them, or he can modify them, entirely up to the director's discretion. So what I try and do is give him as much information as I can in regards to the specifics as I see them. What I like to do is get people's names, and I try very hard to spell them correctly. So the way we'll go with it with the hearing today, we'll ask the department to make the presentation. If there's an appellant, we'll ask them to speak. I ask when you start speaking that you state your name and then spell it for me so that I get it correct. And if you're representing the property owner or someone else, if you could just state your relationship or what that is, so I can note that in the records if you have an expertise or an arborist or whatever that might be. Technically 3 minutes per person, although there will be some leeway if somebody has something that's important to say. If you take the time to go to the meeting, I want to give you an opportunity to hear it, but I do give myself the discretion to ask you to wrap it up if you're simply repeating yourself or saying something that others have already covered. So with that, I want to just acknowledge Cerise Waiters, who's our clerk today, and will be coordinating the hearing. So thank you, Cerise. The work is really done in the backgrounds, and this is just my little part here today. And so the department and everyone here has worked very hard putting this together. So with that, Cerise, you want to call the first item? First item is order.
Yes.
No, I can do it. It doesn't matter.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
So we'll go down the agenda. I think it's different than the PowerPoint that's put together. But so the first item is order number 205117, 539 Bryan Street. My understanding is that it's been postponed or continued. Is that correct? And continued at request of the department or the applicant or some other party, or?
It is continued at the request of the applicant.
Okay, very good. So item number one, done. Does anyone from the public wish to speak on item number one? Very good, hearing none. We'll close item number one, move on to item number two or number three on the agenda. Order number 205118, 1056 Carolina Street. Removal of one significant tree on private property without replacement. Staff approved the removal and the public has protested. So would the department like to start the presentation?
And can everyone see my screen?
Yes, can you please state your name and spell it for everyone?
So my name is Susan Nawberry. I'm an inspector with the Bureau of Urban Forestry. I'll be representing the Bureau in the hearing tonight.
Very good, thank you. Please go on.
So our first order, pardon. So I just want to start with a little summary of Street Tree SF. A lot of people ask us about Street Tree SF, but basically, sorry about that. My mouse is a little crazy. So we're basically pruning trees strategically based on our grid and census we had done, and it basically gives us our priority orders. But I believe all these removals they're based. One removal is a private tree, and so that Street Tree SF doesn't apply. And then for the second item, the library, the idea that our highest priority trees applies there and how we apply our maintenance schedule. So skipping Bryant. So 1056 Carolina Street, it's the removal of one significant tree on private property without replacement. And the staff approved the removal and the public has protested. And basically a significant tree is a tree that's within 10 feet of the public right of way. And it has to be 12 inches in diameter or 20 feet in height or 15-foot canopy spread. It only has to be one of those three things. And so we have a eucalyptus and it is growing fairly close to the property and it's in a narrow sidewalk as well. That's not the reason for removal, as you can see. And these trees have a potential to become much, much, much larger than this. It's a pretty young eucalyptus. Unfortunately, the tree sits right on top of several utilities. The main one being that sewer line there. That's that square on the right. And the sewer is damaged, needs to be replaced. The property owner can no longer, they don't have a working sewer line. And in order to access the sewer line, they have to get under the tree. And usually it's pretty difficult to tunnel and trench a sewer line, so trenching has to occur. And any sort of work that would need to be done to get to that line and trench it would destabilize any tree roots. So the tree essentially cannot remain. There's no real feasible way to replace a sewer line when the tree is directly on top of it. And here are the utilities bundled in the sidewalk. Also, the sidewalk is very narrow. We don't allow tree plantings in narrow sidewalks because usually it only takes a few years for them to buckle the sidewalk on the other flag. And then you're constantly cutting roots and removing a tree that's been planted in a narrow sidewalk. So by the time it even gets to a point where it could provide any sort of benefits, it has to be removed. So we don't plant trees in narrow sidewalks anymore. We try to spend our resources planting trees in wider sidewalks. So yeah, it's right on top of the sewer line, and it can't, and to the right is the entryway, so it can't really be moved there, and then to the left would not be adequate space from the sewer or any of the utility lines, so there really isn't a good spot to put a new tree, unfortunately. I kind of commend the property owners for putting a eucalyptus in such a small spot to begin with. But unfortunately, we would never plant a new replacement tree here or require the property owner to do that in private property. So as I stated before, and to reiterate, there's no room for a replacement tree. The existing tree is already in a very constrained spot. The sidewalk is too narrow to plant a new tree, and there's utilities. And mainly the reason for removal is the fact that the sewer cannot be replaced without removing the tree. So we approve the removal of this one street tree at 1056 Carolina. And that concludes the buff presentation.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Nodbury. Is the applicant here? Does the applicant want to speak? We'll give the applicant the first opportunity. Do we know I know Ms. Howard wants to speak. Ms. Howard, let's unmute. Let's see here. How do we do
that? Mr. Goldberg, we did have Rick Batia holding his hand up. Were you ready, Mr. Batia? Let me.
Hello, can you confirm you can hear me? This is Rick.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you for allowing me to speak for a second. I am the owner of the property with my wife at 1056 Carolina. And thank you, Susan, for pointing out the photos there. Those are fantastic and kind of explaining this scenario. I'd only like to add in a couple other comments if I may. And use
Sure, please.
the 3 minutes I have. Great. If I can share my screen here.
Okay, just a moment. If you need to share, I will promote you to panelist so you can share.
Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, now you will need to go ahead and unmute yourself and then you can begin to share your screen.
Excellent. Excellent. So thank you for that, Cerise. And
Yes.
I wanted to just highlight a couple of things here as far as the tree. And the primary issue is, as Susan pointed out, is the roots of that mature tree growing into that utility sector there, and specifically the sewage line. And what we've seen over the last couple of years since owning the house, and I want to highlight two things here. Almost exactly to 12 months, we've had to have two different plumbing companies come out. And what takes place is that the sewage, as you would imagine, backs up from the roots of that tree growing into that main line. They back up the sewage. That sewage then runs into our house, into the bathtub, into the bathroom. And so we had to have the plumbers come out and assess the damage, assess what's taking place. And this is the invoice from the first time they came out in 2020. And the notes here in description of the sewer line found it was backing up due to roots. And they have to hydrojet it. And they also had stated it's a temporary solution, right? So it's gonna just keep coming back if we keep doing what we're doing now. And the next invoice I'll highlight is from almost a year later in March. R&L Plumbing recently had to come out and they had to do the same thing, right? And so you've got these cracked house traps that are inside of this sewer line that are backing up and causing the problem. And what happened as a result of this one, though, besides the cost of having to do this over and over every year, is, let me highlight something here. We have our downstairs got flooded with sewage. So we had to go forward with, a renovation now due to the problem of the roots of the tree growing into the sewage line. And so that's something that we're really hoping to prevent from having to do, once a year. And it was a major job. I think the other element here to highlight is I did have an arborist come out and take a look at the tree and look to see what we can do. And we're hoping to obviously remove the tree. And you can see here the description. It's a removal due to root interference with underground utilities. And I think that's what Susan had highlighted initially. So we're in a position that we feel to have a sustainable solution, it would be to have to remove the tree due to the inability to, have something in place that would allow us not to have a sewage backup every single year and have something that's sustainable. And then how do we do this? Is removing the tree and then eventually working on the stump and the roots of that tree as option one to get out of the sewage line. So that is something I wanted to showcase today. Thank you. Unless you have questions.
No questions. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Next speaker, I believe it's Ms. Howard. Let's see here if we can.
I believe Ms. Howard was for a different
Oh, okay.
item. She'll be
All right.
coming up soon.
All right. Very
Right now,
good.
we have Lance Carnes, if you're ready for public comments. Are you ready for the public comments?
I've unmuted him.
Okay.
See,
Have I?
I've got it. Okay, I should be unmuted now.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Mr. Carnes.
Yeah, hi. Yes, as far as the owner goes, I've had trees like that too, and I think it has to go. I'd encourage the owner to look into replacing the tree, if not on his own property, perhaps on an adjacent property. We need trees in the city. So Also, I wonder if Mr. Goldberg could pass the following comments on to the DPW director. And the theme of this is, where is the Bureau of Urban Forestry, also called BUF? Recently, SFMTA ran its own hearing of tree
No,
removals.
Mr. Carnes, we need to limit the speech to this specific item. And so if you have more comments regarding this specific issue, we're happy to listen, but beyond that, we're not going to address it.
I thought I had 3 minutes to,
Not just
make
general
comments.
comments, 3 minutes on this issue.
and that's by your judgment, huh?
That's just that's good enough for me. Yeah, we'll work with that.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Clip, I see you're next up, or you want to speak? I've unmuted you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, Mr. Clip. Go ahead, please.
I will say it's dicey territory to decide what's relevant or not in a public comment. But I'm going to go ahead and just talk about this and say that, first of all, for this property owner, I can relate that our building has had really bad sewage issues, and I have personally shoveled raw sewage off our grounds, and it's really awful, and I very much feel for him and his family. What I want to point out is there was no discussion of in lieu fees or whether the applicant will be paying for the replacement value of this tree. I know that there are a lot of opinions across San Francisco about eucalyptus specifically, but regardless of what your opinion is, it's indisputable that these are excellent for carbon sequestration, and that mature trees are especially efficient at carbon sequestration, which is something that our environment desperately needs right now. So for the loss of this tree, whether it's avoidable or not, it's still an environmental loss. And I didn't hear anything from the city or the applicant about how that loss will be met. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clip. Does anyone else want to speak to this issue? Bowler?
Yes, we have
What?
DJ.
Go ahead. One second. Have we unmuted the next
Yes,
speaker?
I did.
Okay.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, we
can.
can.
Yeah, I was going to say that I certainly sympathize with the problem that the owners are dealing with. I certainly wonder why they might not be interested in planting another tree where that one is gone. I think theirs is maybe the house that's reseated there, the small cottage type house. Although the neighbors have a tree, if the tree on the left is their abode, then that would be relevant, but the tree in the back might get shade from a tree. And again, we do need all the green leaves on the ends of branches that we can have here in the city. And it would be a good thing where that, well, it'd be a long time before that amount of sequestration could happen. But it would be nice if the owners saw their way to planting another tree. And it's possible that the director would be aware of the situation and consider the need for the tree. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Are there any other speakers on this? Mr. Nolte, I see your hand is up.
Good evening. My name is John Nolte, N-U-L-T-Y, and I'm calling in regards to a couple of things. First, I didn't hear any timeline in which the tree is proposed to be removed, and also the issue that they've already stated, like prior people, that the tree has not been, there's no discussion by Burf or the property owner to replace the tree or pay in lieu fees for the tree, because this is a significant tree, I find a little disturbing. And also not knowing, not only seeing the site of the tree and not seeing the whole property, and not knowing whether or not at another location on the property behind the fence, a tree could go, or a tree could go somewhere adjacent to the property on that street, even though they said the sidewalks were narrow, maybe across the street. I don't know what the size of the sidewalks across the street are. So we have to start thinking bigger than what Burf has been doing in the past, and looking at putting these trees in the neighborhood with the property owner and making an agreement with the owner or neighbors to water the tree depending on where it goes. And I also didn't hear what size the box size would go in. We're taking on a fairly almost mature tree, so I would like a big box size tree to be placed in replacement of this tree. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Mr. Nolte. Cerise, do you see anyone else? I don't see
Hey,
anyone else with the
I
hand up.
see no other hands at this time.
Okay, if there's no other discussion, we'll close this matter. And thank you for everyone's comments, and we'll move on to the next one. The final item on the agenda for tonight is order number 204962, 100 Larkin Street, the main library, to consider the removal of 17 ficus trees with replacement on Grove Street and Hyde Street, frontages in the main library. If the department would like to speak.
Hi, so again, this is Susan Nawberry with the Bureau of Urban Forestry. And there was a recent tree failure at the sidewalk grade. One of the ficus trees at the main entrance on Grove on May 29th had failed. And there was another emergency removal on June 10th on Hyde Street. That tree was failing. So both of the lower trunks of the trees had very little taper and they were decayed, which caused the stem failures. So on Hyde Street, there are 8 trees proposed for removal. And on Grove Street, there are 9 trees. We first just want to start talking a little bit about the structure, because the initial removal application was based on this, a lot of it was based on structure and our ficus removal criteria. But also to discuss like what a visible root flare looks like on a healthy tree that's planted correctly. So we'll start with the included bark. On the left, you can see that there's a very tight union there in between the 2 limbs. And as they grow, they become pushed apart, and in between you also get decay. So that is not a sustainable branching structure. And having equal diameter stems can also lead to more of a lever arm effect and cause failing as well. So you get bark that grows and pushes the limbs apart, and then also you have kind of just this lever arm that all the weight is at the end of these limbs, and they pull the limbs apart at the main union. And then on the bottom, you have an example of what bad root flare, non-visible root flare looks like, and visible root flare. So the tree on the left is planted below grade, and the ground is basically somewhere on the stem, and that leads to decay on the main stem. And it also doesn't allow the root flare to build good structure and these buttresses on these roots that help build stability. So this is just an example of what the inside of that codominant branch structure looks like. That's where the branch bark ridge, or the lack thereof, that's where the decay kind of forms, and it's starting to, it grew bark in between in the union, and it did exactly what I said it would do, which it pushes apart and it failed. So that is not good branching structure. And this is what happens when it gets too large and the amount of bark in between the union gets too thick and pushes the union apart. So the original application was based on this like ficus criteria, but and our ficus criteria, we assess the ficus first and then see if it kind of matches criteria. It's not this rubber stamp. We don't just say, oh, it's a ficus, we're going to remove it. We look at the canopy vigor, the failure history. We see if it has competing codominant stems or acute angles of attachment, which a lot of ficus do, which is why this criteria was written, because they have a high likelihood of failure because of the way they have these branch unions, and it's very typical of this species. So they're large trees with multiple competing trunks and stems. And a lot of times you have large limbs that are damaged by vehicles. And again, with that lever arm, you have a long limb with a lot of canopy on top and it gets hit by a truck. This happens a lot on the larger corridors. And it can remove like 30% or more of the canopy when the truck hits it. And root pruning history is a criteria for ficus removal, utility conflicts, and a live crown ratio. Again, with that lever arm effect, if you have a lot of canopy very high on the tree, it's very hard to restructure it. So we'll start with Hyde Street, tree 1. And so we assessed all these trees and we're looking at their structure, and this tree has a codominant stem structure. And it really, it's like near impossible to correct at this point because you'd have to remove more than half the canopy, and these trees are already stressed. So once you start to do that, the tree becomes a whole tree removal. And then you end up creating wounds that are too large for the tree to heal. But in assessing all these trees for structure, we now have looked closer. Well, we did document this previously. We've now looked closer at the reverse taper and the lack of a root flare, and the fact that all these trees are pretty much buried well below sidewalk grade. And like I mentioned before, as they grow, they can become girdled and decay can occur where there isn't oxygen reaching the main stem. And it's very difficult for these trees to put on good structure at the roots where they can be stable. And most of the roots on a tree are at the top 18 inches. So as you can see, when the tree is buried and the main roots aren't on the top 18 inches of the surface, those roots need air, and the roots are not getting it on these trees. So another tree here, again, it has reverse taper, it has a no visible root crown or root flare, and they're sitting in standing water. So I want to, again, talk about, like, this is a properly planted tree. This is a diagram of a properly planted tree. And you can see that the root flare is at grade with the soil. But I've drawn a line here where we're estimating the library sidewalk grade is. And so the root flare is just buried well below the surface, and the roots need oxygen and they're just not getting it. Then they're also very constrained by the pavers around the stem, so they're not able really to sway and put on structural wood around where the root flare is. So just pointing out that they have competing codominant stems with acute angles of attachment. But again, we're dealing with every single tree has reverse taper and no root flare. They're all sitting in standing water. This one has a large wound at the base of its trunk, so we're more concerned about decay occurring in the roots. And just sorry if these look repetitive because all these trees have very similar structure. And again, we're having to deal with trees with essentially no root flare and competing limbs here. So each one of these have very similar structure with the competing limbs, and you can see that the interior canopy, like we're dealing with trying to prune them for clearance, but also have this structure. It's very difficult to remedy once these trees become established. So more, again, each tree, essentially, there's not really one tree on this property that has, that's been planted at grade. And this one has particularly poor structure, so we're concerned about that. And so, sorry, yeah, if these do look repetitive, I just want to show that these trees they are all very similar. They all have very similar issues. And with tree 9, this tree was actively failing. You can see on the left, there's a lean, and that lean is new. It's not an established lean. There's not any corrective sweep there. So it became an emergency removal, so we did have to remove it. And it was noticed when we had to perform an emergency cleanup on Grove, which I will get to. So this tree is gone. And we've also created a situation where we have kind of opened up the next tree for failure, because now that this tree is gone, the tree on the right there is not really protected. So we're kind of worried about this domino effect. And I've kind of shown how every single one of these trees has been girdled by the pavers, and more importantly, has been planted well below grade, long before any of us, came on the scene here. So I just want to point out that these were planted so long ago, people probably didn't even think about what a root flare meant back then. So I just want to say, before anyone starts to say, why wasn't this fixed? A tree is planted a very long time ago, and this is kind of the result of these trees growing in that condition. And so I do want to point out that it is hard to predict these failures. And so now we're just concerned, as we start to remove these trees, what will happen to the trees next to them. And this tree had structural issues, but we removed it based on that girdling and that active stem failure. So Grove Street, there are now 9 trees. And with tree 1, again, we're dealing with this reverse tapering, girdling. These trees are larger, so it's even more of a concern. And you can it's hard to see, but you look very closely, there's like a little bit of what looks like kind of soot. It's decayed material where the paver is pressing up against the bark of the tree. So this one had a limb failure. So we did discuss how these weakly attached limbs fail, and this one had a limb failure. Again, tree 2, this has that reverse taper and it's also dying. So again, we removed this dead tree or dying tree. We haven't done it yet. And then the other 2 trees are now more exposed. And there's not really much that can be done with this tree, is once you prune off whatever dead material that is, you have very little living material in that tree. This one has particularly bad structure as well. Not only are they codominant stems, but they're kind of wrapping around each other. So this tree is completely girdled by the pavers. I'm not even sure you couldn't really remove pavers and get it to start growing good structural wood. At this point, it would be very difficult for these trees of this size to start building roots and buttress structure on these roots in order to stabilize themselves. They're just too big for them to recover from the way they've been growing for this long. And so tree 4, we had a very worrisome failure here. And that's just a little decay pocket. It looks a little bit compartmentalized, and then it's not really that badly girdled. But we still had, and this also had poor structure, but we still had a major failure here. So as I pointed out, like some of these trees, tree 3 had far worse girdling and it's still standing, but we're not really sure when it will fail. And now that tree 4 is gone next to it, we're becoming increasingly concerned about the rest of these trees. And again, I mentioned that the girdling here isn't even as bad, but we still had a major failure at that point. And it did land on a truck where one of our employees was in it. And thankfully he's okay, but it was very concerning and he's terrified for his life when this happened. So to basically reiterate my point with all these photos, I know they seem very repetitive, but we basically are dealing with a situation where we can't really predict the stem failures here because all of these trees have a very similar situation, what's going on with this tree that failed. And you can see where the trunk is circled, that there's a bunch of necrotic tissue around the bark. So this tree didn't have an opportunity to put on good structural roots because they're well below grade. And then B, that because the tree is buried, it had a lot of decay up against the main stem and the roots just did not develop very well. So because of this and the way all the rest of the trees have a very similar condition, we're concerned that the trees are just not safe to remain, and it's just not very easy to predict which one is going to fail at this point. And so I think I've made my point with the reverse taper and the girdling and the failure, but I just want to continue that with the rest of the trees. Tree 5, that's now exposed because tree 4 is gone. And it is also girdling. It has no root flare and it's sitting in standing water. And it does have this poor structure. And same with tree 6, it has very little to no root flare and poor structure. That's difficult to remedy without removing too much canopy. Yeah. And tree 8 has a lot of girdling, and it's standing and sitting in water as well. Yeah. So basically, because of the fact that these trees, A, have very poor structure that is very difficult to remedy without removing an excess of canopy, and B, because they're all planted well below grade and this cannot be corrected. The trees are too large. They haven't had a good chance to put on any taper. They don't have good root flares. Even if you were to remove the pavers and excavate around the trees are just too large and established to actually build enough structural roots to actually support trees of this size. So for this reason, Buff is proposing that we remove 17 trees at 100 Larkin with replacement.
Okay, does that conclude your presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess my question is, what are we going to replace them with? Do we have a timeline? Do we have a species? Do we have a size? Because I think those are important issues to discuss. And who's going to be responsible for them? I'm assuming the Library Commission were these street trees that were Buffs, or were this the Library Commission, or can you kind of go into some of that?
Yeah, so technically, yeah, these library trees. The initial application, they weren't the responsibility of Public Works, but now then the passage of Prop E occurred and they became the responsibility of Public Works. And now with this recent failure, the Bureau is initiating this removal. And so the removal is the responsibility of the Bureau, and in partnership with the library and their ability to water, we can plant trees with the assistance of the library and their ability to water all of them. And we're looking at planting 24-inch box. We're looking at planting deciduous trees because it gets very dark around Civic Center, especially in the winter time. And a lot of deciduous trees are, they're trees that grow quickly and can sequester carbon and provide shade, but also meet the objectives of the adjacent property owner.
Okay. Do we have I'm just thinking for the public, do we have a species, or is this is this still a topic for discussion?
We initially discussed red maple, but I'm just putting out there deciduous tree of some sort because nursery availability is not 100% easy to predict, but I'm sure we can find red maples. And I had suggested London plane trees as an alternate, but what we realized is there's quite a few London plane trees in the area, and in order to avoid like a monoculture being planted in that Civic Center area, we thought red maple would be a good species, and we think the library has the capacity to water a species like red maple.
Okay, and you'd be looking at a 24-inch box?
Yeah, that is basically yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then a timeline. How consistent would it be? I'm just aware that city projects sometimes get delayed.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to promise a timeline because it's very difficult to predict where 80 people will be at one time. So yeah, I know like this is a very important property, and the loss of canopies is a really big deal here in Civic Center. We're not tone deaf to that, but I can't promise like a perfect timeline or exact timeline.
No, I understand, but I know there's going to be concern from the public and for me that we pull out the trees and 3 years later we're still waiting for replacements. So
yeah,
I guess my sense is there's a desire to make it somewhat contemporaneous with the removal, or
yes,
shortly following. Okay, all right. And nothing, there's going to be no resolution today, but I guess I would just encourage anyone that wants to speak to send their recommendations into Buff as far as what they would like to see as a replacement if the director decides that these trees should be removed. I realize nothing can be decided tonight, so but at least they can put something on file and have it there that should these existing trees be removed, that what they would like to see. Okay. All right. Well, very good with that. Let's go to public comment to see who would like to speak on this matter. I understand there's a couple of raised hands, at least.
Yes, the first hand is Lance Carnes.
Mr. Carnes?
Go ahead, Mr. Carnes.
Okay, I assume I'm unmuted. So I was around back in 2018, middle of 2018, when these trees, 19 trees around the library, were first proposed for removal. And we heard the same song and dance that Ms. Nodberry just gave us, that they had codominant stems and bad taper and the whole deal. So that was 3 years ago. And the project, the removal was instigated by the library, who wanted to do their own project. About a year ago, the library pulled out. They decided they didn't want to remove the trees for their own project. So these trees have been sitting around for a year without any inspection. I just took a look at the tree database that DPW keeps. And in fact, the last time the trees were surveyed was August 2018. And the recent survey was done in June 2021 after the tree failure. So no inspections were done for 3 years between August 2018 and June 2021, when they could have done the inspection and perhaps amelioration of the problems. So, and if the tree hadn't fallen on the DPW truck, the trees would not have been inspected until the next scheduled pruning in 2023, 2024. That would have been 5 years without an inspection of the trees by DPW. So I would suggest that they keep on the ball and maybe inspect trees that aren't failing. And I also want to point out that when one tree fails, that doesn't mean all trees in the area need to be removed. Looked in the database, and on the Grove Street frontage, number 4 failed recently. The other 9 in the database are indicated as being inspected, and there are no notes on the condition, no codominant stems and things that Ms. Narvare mentioned. So, you know, in a database where you're inspecting something, you should have some notes that say, you know, why it's critical that these trees be removed, what the problems are, yada, yada. There's nothing in there. Similar with the High Street frontage. There are 7 trees that were never inspected according to the database. Trees, I think it's 2 through 8. And so how can you declare that they must be removed if you haven't found any fault or noted any fault in the database?
30 seconds.
Okay. And I just want to point out that the same group of us who opposed the tree back in 2018 will be appealing this hearing result once it comes through, and they always come through in favor of the city. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Carnes. Next speaker, I see, we'll just go down the list if that works for everyone.
We have
Ms. Sing-
Maureen Singleton.
Correct. Go ahead. Ms. Singleton?
Hi, yes. Hi, my name is Maureen Singleton. I am the Chief Operating Officer for the San Francisco Public Library. I want to thank you for this opportunity today to speak on this item. I want to express the library's support of Public Works' proposed plan for these 17 ficus trees on our Hyde and Grove Street exteriors of the main library. We also wanted to make sure that it was clear that we are committed to the replacement program and helping get these trees established during these important early years of the establishment process. And then lastly, I just really wanted to thank the Public Works Bureau of Urban Forestry team for all the work that they've done on these trees and doing these inspections to assess the current condition of these trees and determining what are the best next steps to keep the public safe in these areas that are high traffic in and out of the library and around the library at the main library. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and that concludes my statements.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Singleton. Next, I see Susan Bryan.
I'm sorry, this is Susan Nalberry. I just want to, sorry, I've just gotten word that we can commit to planting within 6 months.
Oh,
In,
that's, I
in
think
6
that's
months.
okay. Very good. Thank you very much for that update. So, Ms. Bryan, do you want to speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Sure can. Go ahead.
Okay, I've been fascinated by this description, and I wanted to say, I mean, what was wrong with the trees? I would be very heartened if actually you kind of really did replace the canopy and with other trees. And apparently I didn't know about how the roots needed oxygen. But like I say, it's going to take a lot of time to really replace the good that the trees do. is there ways of possibly planting trees elsewhere in addition to replacing the trees?
Well, I mean, I guess, anything's possible. I mean, I'll certainly, I include those kinds of comments in my notes to the director. It's up to the director to decide what, if anything, needs to be done beyond the commitments that are made in addition to, his initial decision to remove and replace. But thank you.
Thank you. I was a part of Friends of the, I mean, I was able to steer some money to Friends of the Urban Forest a few years ago, and we were able to have about 26 trees planted.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll lower my hand.
Okay.
Oh, no, it says raised, so it's lowered.
It's
Okay, thank you.
lowered. No, thank you, Ms. Bryan. Ms. Howard, I see your hand up. You got, there you are.
Okay, great. Yeah, I admired these trees for years, and I really oppose their removal. They provide a beautiful framework for the library. It'll be many, many years before replacement trees can fill the void. And I find it unfortunate that all of the trees here are all of a sudden considered unworthy of preservation. In the case of the lack of root flare, I don't know why these trees have been left like this. Being planted a long time ago is not an excuse for poor care recently. The pavers shown in the photos pressed against the bark are described as if they kind of miraculously appeared there. It is clear from the photos that the pavers closest to the trees were added after the original pavers were installed. They don't match the pattern. Someone made a decision to put them there and to cement the pavers in place, further limiting air penetration into the soil. Poor drainage is something that should be addressed as soon as it becomes evident. There has to be accountability for poor care like this. Even if the trees are replaced, if the same institution gives them the same poor care and the planting conditions remain the same, the results will be the same or worse because ficus are pretty tough trees. National Geographic just published a study that illustrated that underserved communities have little or no tree cover. This neighborhood is diverse, and the people living here deserve to have beautiful, mature trees. Without these trees, the area is going to become part of the overall derelict feeling of this part of the city landscape. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Howard. Mr. Clip, I see your hand up. You look like you're next.
And Mr. Goldberg, before we have Mr. Clip, I just wanted to let everyone know, if you are dialing in and you wanted to raise your hand, hit *9 to raise your hand, and then *6 to unmute your phone. Again, if you're calling in, use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute your phone. Thank you. Just a moment, Mr. Clip. Okay, go ahead. You should be able to speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So one of the points made was that there's no root flare visible. And I just want to note that that's because the city planted them that way. The city planted those trees incorrectly. I'm a volunteer planting leader with Friends of the Urban Forest, and even I know that's not how you plant a tree. In terms of structure and pruning and angles of attachment, again, this was always the city's responsibility to maintain these trees, and they could have, quote, corrected those a long time ago. And so it is the city that dropped the ball. Same thing with standing water. That's not something that just happens. That's something that happens when you plant below grade and then power wash with chemicals every day. In terms of the roots needing air, same thing. It's the city that put those bricks there and then left the bricks there. These are some of the youngest ficus in the city. They were planted by the city at the opening of the main library, which I believe was in the mid-90s. And there are a lot of ficus much older than those all over San Francisco. And the condition that these are in now is squarely on the city's shoulders. So this is my request. First of all, that this hearing be postponed until the Bureau has actually done its due diligence in checking the below ground conditions. I did not see a single photo in this presentation of the bricks pulled back to check the actual condition of the roots of those trees. So it's hard to understand as a member of the public why we're saying the trees aren't viable if we can't even see their flares and their roots. I'd also like to see if there's been any examination of whether the girdling can be mitigated by actually giving those trees some room to grow. I would like to point out that the trees at Second and Folsom, the city had determined were too girdled to be viable, but then they took another look and backtracked on that. And now there are many beautiful sycamores still at the corner of Second and Folsom. And finally, I'd like to ask the city to come up with a better plan, because it's totally irresponsible to propose a total clear cut when you consider this removal in the context of a complete tree removal right across the street at 1169 Market Street, which a bunch of us just attended that removal hearing. The BART tree removals that are happening up and down Market. Many of us attended that hearing just last month. The removals that are happening as part of the Upper Market Street project, that was just a few months ago, and the oncoming proposed removal of hundreds of trees along Market for the Better Market Streets project. Briefly about red maples, those were proposed the last time the city tried to remove all of those trees, and there was a lot of concern about the success of those trees, even by the Board of Appeals, because of how much water they require and the fact that they're not drought tolerant. And deciduous trees are great, but I agree with Susan, we shouldn't be planting a monoculture. It would be better to have a mix of deciduous and evergreen for our year-round mild climates. In terms of replacement, I want to point out that the last time the city sought to remove all these trees, it was not proposing a 1-for-1 replacement. It proposed 3 fewer trees because of infrastructural conflicts, and nothing's being said about that tonight. So the bottom line here is that if the city had done its job, these trees would still have a lot of life ahead of them. And when the city's negligence causes this kind of environmental loss, this is a loss of cooling, which we need. I may not seem like we need it, but we're going to need it come September and October. Carbon sequestration, habitat, because there actually are quite a bit of birds that live in those trees. And this is a loss of greenery in a neighborhood with less than 4% canopy, in a city that has less than 14% canopy, making it the least canopied major city in the United States. This is a tremendous loss, and the city needs to come up with a much better plan to compensate for this loss, and especially a loss that it created. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Cliff. Next, Ms. Bowler. Ms. Bowler,
Yeah.
you've been unmuted. Go ahead.
Well, I might start with agreeing with what Mr. Clip had to say, as well as others who feel that effort should be made to keep the trees. And it is true that the last time around, it was decided that a certain number of those trees were viable, and they can't have become less viable all of a sudden. Removing the bricks or that cement around the base of the trees would certainly help, and trimming the trees appropriately, which has not been done in perhaps, I don't know when, would also be advisable thing to do. And as for the replacement trees, I don't think that there should be deciduous trees there. I don't even like to discuss the replacement, but I have to. Dropping leaves there on the sidewalk is not what you need. And as for the trees lacking leaves half the time, you lose the opportunity to help clear the air from the gas fumes and everything else that goes on there. So I would suggest looking at other species to replace at least the trees that have already been removed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bowler. Thank you for your time in speaking. The next speaker with a hand up is a caller. The last 3 numbers are 092. If that person would like to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
I sure can. Did you want to give
Awesome.
your name for the record, or you're not required to?
No thanks. No,
Okay,
thank you.
go ahead.
Yeah, this is an issue that I'm just starting to wrap my brain around, and I know it's a complex issue, and especially with people's safety and fear of falling branches, and the experience of having a limb fall on your truck. But I think I would like to iterate the points that the other speakers have made. I think especially Mr. Carnes, I think it was, and Clip, about the data and the holistic impact of these removals. And what I didn't hear from the city presenter is a plan to make sure this doesn't happen again. What is going to be put into place to make sure that once they're planted correctly, that they will be taken care of? To the previous lady's comment about who's going to sweep up the leaves, who's going to be able to take care of this. And I think it just kind of shows a lack of foresight in terms of what is really going to happen on the ground once these are planted. This is also not only from doing a one-to-one plan, if that's even part of it, since that detail wasn't shared. Is it going to be more than that to account for the biomass removal? There's a lot of information missing on what's going to happen, what the real impact is on the citizens moving forward, on the infrastructure, on the trees themselves and our environment. So I would just like to request more information for this planning, more information for this diligence, more commitment from the city and the library in writing that these trees will be properly maintained. And yeah, again, thinking about the impact of our environment and all the other trees that are under consideration for removal throughout the city. This is a big problem, a systemic problem, and it's not just these trees. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just my understanding, and perhaps Ms. Nauberry can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a one-for-one replacement according to the order. It's remove with replacement, and perhaps I shouldn't assume it's one for one. Ms. Nauberry, can you speak to that? Is it a one-for-one replacement?
So essentially, yes, I do need to look into the bus zone area, but if the sidewalk is wide enough in the bus zone, we can have trees there. But essentially it's removal with replacement. We think these are in below ground containers, so then kind of the utilities wouldn't exactly apply there. We'll look into what below ground containers are there on what side as well.
Okay, very good, thank you. Next speaker is, I see, just going down the list, is Roz Arbel. I hope I didn't ruin your name.
Hi there. No, you said it properly. Thank you. I just want to reiterate what the other speakers have been saying. Can you hear me all right?
Sure can. You're doing great.
All right. Well, basically, I literally, every time I turn around lately within the last, I don't know, 6 months or so, there is some massive tree removal that is being proposed by the city. You know, we have 24th Street, we have Octavia Street, we have Upper Market. And, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, there's a hearing to remove 50 trees from the middle part of Market Street. And then I hear about this, and it just seems like the city is deforesting San Francisco at a pretty rapid rate. You know, we have a mandate where there's supposed to be, I don't know, like 50,000 trees planted by 2035. And right now we're kind of going in reverse, right? We seem to be removing more than planting. And, you know, I don't need to tell you all that we are in the middle of a climate crisis. Even though it's cold over here in San Francisco, that doesn't mean that we're not going to pay up soon enough. You know, just a couple of years ago, we had a day where it was 106 degrees, you know. So it's extremely perplexing as to why we keep removing trees without a really good plan of how to reforest San Francisco. And I understand that there's replacements, planned, but nothing stands in for a mature tree as far as sequestering CO2. So, I think that I would suggest that the trees stay. And if not, that a more viable option, environmentally sensitive option be considered. That's it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Mr. Nolte, I see your hand up. Would you like to speak? There we go.
Yeah, can you hear me? My name is Michael Nolte. I'm the Executive Director of Alliance for a Better District 6. And the main library is in District 6. And basically the library is our library for the district. These trees are mature and appearing and healthy. And they like to point out that the continuing removal of healthy trees have negative impacts to the density and the volume of our urban forest canopy, which is less than 13%. And as mentioned before, it's only 4% in our neighborhood. And runs counter to climate change and policies and outlines in the San Francisco General Plan. It also removes a source of cooling and shade for the many senior citizens that frequent the main library. I happen to be a senior. And these trees provide traffic calming and for busy streets, and but also provide people calming and in the common connections for nature. I think it's very important to understand that we need to have the people calming part, especially in the Civic Center area. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nolte. Mr. John Nolte, I see your hand is up. Would you like to speak, sir?
Good evening. Yes, I would like to speak. This is John Nolte. First, I want to make some comments. One, the library is on a square block. And if you look at the other two sides of this block that are not being talked about tonight, you'll see the trees that have been removed on those sides, and the library has not replaced them. So I have a problem that on the Larkin Street side and on the Fulton Street side, there are trees and empty plots that the library has not fulfilled to replace in the last 3 years. So, and also this item, these trees were again back in July of 2018 were proposed to be removed. I have an online petition of over 8,000 signatures since 2018 saying that these trees should be kept. And that petition was started in 2018 when the main library decided to remove the ficus trees. And it was the main library that also, it was in their head that they wanted to remove the ficus trees at that location because they had also taken out ficus trees at other locations at another branch. So I'm concerned about the library, just doing this for their own reason. We don't hear about a plan. They've had 3 years to get their act together. They have not come up with a plan. And now you're bringing it back to the community and redoing the whole process over again. But you never created a plan the first time around. And I don't expect you to do it this time around because that's the way bureaucracy works. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for speaking, Mr. Nolte. Anyone else? Does anyone else want to speak? Seeing none. Okay. Seeing none, we'll close this item then. I want to thank you all for your time in calling in and letting me know of your concerns so that I can pass those on to the director. I want to thank Cerise Waiters for her help in behind the scenes and taking care of this. Cerise, do you have all the information and names that you want so that you can pass on information to people should they need it?
Yes, I do. And if there's anyone who wants to add another statement, you can send it to urbanforestry@sfdpw.org. I'll put it in the chat as well.
Okay, very good. So we'll stay on for a couple more minutes. So if people want to add their email addresses or things for communication to make sure you get the information, I will prepare my recommendations to the director with very brief summaries of the comments as I recall them. This is being recorded, so there will be a recording of this should anyone need this for any action in the future. So with that, I will just thank you all for your time. Thanks, Cerise, for her time, and wish you all a good evening and stay safe and healthy. Okay, very good. Thank you very much.